Okay, well, let's try to understand the Gospels together, and let's lay a foundation first. So let's get our PowerPoints here, and let's get started. So we have what we call 4 canonical Gospels. That means they appear in the established New Testament. The Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of John. And they're written at different stages, different dates. Mark somewhere between 66 and 70. Luke after the fall of the temple, 70 to 80. Matthew after that, 80 to 90. And then John closes out somewhere at the end of the first century between 90 and 100. They're also written to different audiences. Mark is believed to be written to Christians in Rome. Luke is written to Theophilus, we think kind of a more of an uppity person in the area of Rome. Matthew, written to Jewish Christians in Antioch, Syria. And then John, it's kind of a circular document. It's written to Christians in Asia Minor, current day Turkey, maybe the area of Ephesus, and meant to be spread around in the churches there. They also seem to emphasize different parts of the same Jesus story. Mark emphasizes Jesus as the suffering king. Luke picks up as God, Jesus as God of the underdog. He really just takes it up for the marginalized. Matthew emphasizes Jesus the Messiah, kind of the new Moses, a theme of the Old Testament. And then John is cryptic. Jesus is the Logos, the Word. So what are these canonical Gospels? So this brings us to the literary idea of genre, types of literature, just like you have types of movies, or when you look at your streaming, it has little categories. Are they biographies, or are they what we call Greco-Roman lives? And the textbook talks about that. If there are biographies, you would expect there to be more background, more of a gradual discussion of people's lives, but that doesn't seem to be it. It looks like these are more what we call Greco-Roman lives, where you highlight the main events of the person, and this might then also explain why there is very little information about Jesus's early life. So let's talk first about the synoptics, and we will treat the Gospel of John later. Synoptics means seeing together. You get this idea of optics there, the seeing, the glasses, seeing together, not just anything, but seeing together the life of Jesus. Why are these first 3 Gospels so alike? Well, because if you put them together, you really see the life of Jesus in a very similar way. And it brings us to the question, what do they have in common? How many sources are there that brings together a similarity there? Okay, so here's an example of a Greek manuscript. This is Mark 1, Archeta Gigargan, so it's in the beginning. And so the question is, did all of them have this? What's the chicken, what's the egg? So who was first? We call that priority. What gospel had priority? Was the Gospel of Matthew first, or the Gospel of Mark? So people pursued different theories, right? So this idea of the priority of Matthew being first, is not popular anymore, but once upon a time was. So this guy Griesbach came up with the Griesbach hypothesis and say that's first. And there's an F puzzle about it. He said, maybe Matthew was first, and then Luke had a shorter version, and then Mark an even shorter version. But that just doesn't add up. It emphasizes the agreement between Matthew and Luke, but it loses its coherence. It makes just no sense historically or literarily. So the priority of Mark, where Mark is written first, that's widely accepted. And that leads to what we call the 2-source theory by Griesbach. Later on, it was expanded upon by B.H. Streeter, where we get the 4-source theory. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the 2-source theory is most widely accepted, where is used together with Q as sources for Matthew, and Mark and Q are also used as sources for Luke. B.H. Streeter expanded on that. He said, okay, so Matthew and Luke both use Mark, Matthew and Luke both use Q, but they also use their own sources. I find this an attractive theory, except that they say it's a very specific body of sources, and that becomes a little bit more restrictive then, right? So let's take a look at that. So that would account for the extra material that they each have outside of the use of the 2 sources. And that will explain a lot too. So if the Gospel of Mark is first, then the others would rely on that. It's very interesting because combined, Matthew and Luke use, and of course, first divisions are arbitrary, right? Use about 630 verses out of the 661. And so it would look something like this. So you can see they kind of rely differently on Mark. And so putting that in numbers, it would look something like this. Now the Q material is about 220 verses. It's mostly saying verses. And then of course there is unique material that you can approach kind of like in a BH Streeter sort of way. And then of course, since they're both being used as sources, you can see that they rely on that differently. Mark, it's just a visual representation there. Mark rely more on that than Luke. What about, word usage and all, some observations? Well, over half of Mark's vocabulary appears in Matthew and Luke. And some of the wording is verbatim. And Matthew and Luke seem to use Mark's order. So that's very much so something that you expect in So moreover, they have some common material, of course, independently. That would be Q. And very interestingly, Matthew and Luke tend to improve Mark's Greek. Like when there are some simplistic sort of verbal constructions, they will make it more complex. So here's something that's very interesting is, the question, how were the sources used? So if you imagine a scroll, right, some papyrus sheets, if you take a razor blade and you very carefully cut all the stuff that came from Mark out of Matthew's scroll, then what remains, it doesn't make sense. It becomes incoherent. But if you do the same thing with the same razor blade for the Gospel of Luke, you get a flowing story. So it was woven in there differently. It's almost like there was a text and then it was copied back over. That's why they don't really like to talk about the original text, but more like an Ausgangstext, the beginning text. This kind of was worked over. So they depend on the source of Mark in different ways, right? So there's some examples of like really close following, like similarities, and then some dissimilarities. Remember, it gets the name synoptics because it looks alike so much. So here's an example of Jesus saying John the Baptist saying things here. So in Matthew it says, but when he saw many Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, that's John the Baptist, he said to them, and then here comes the wording. Luke simply starts it differently. He just says, well, John said to the crowd. And then look that the actual story of it is like verbatim, word for word. So I think that's very interesting. Now, look here, when you actually find parables told between two different Gospels, they may at first look alike, but they're not. So this idea of the parable of the sheep, we mostly know it as the lost sheep because in our culture, we like this idea of lostness and being found. It's like a happy story. So we're mostly familiar, if you are, with the one in Luke 15, where there's 100 sheep, you lose one of them. Do you not leave the 99 in the wilderness, go after the one, that you're really happy, rejoice with me. But the same parable is discussed in Matthew. The shepherd has 100 sheep, they go astray when you find it. But notice the differences here, okay? Same parable. Notice what happens to the sheep, right? In Luke, you're losing one of them. In Matthew, one goes astray. There's intentionality there, right? In Luke, it lays the sheep on the shoulders. It's very personable, right? Now, in both cases, there's rejoicing, right? Look where they go. The one in Luke goes into the wilderness. Where's the one in Matthew? Leaves the 99 in the mountains. So very interesting, right? One is called a sinner. The other one is the will of the Father in heaven. So then the question becomes, was it told twice? Was it one time? And it's adapted to the audience. God meets people where they are. And yet it's very alike. Here's another one, right? Oops, bringing it back. I want you to take a look at this. Look at that. Look at all the different forms. And you'll have a worksheet for this. I want you to look at this, the three forms. What is similar? What is dissimilar? What is the same? What's not? Who relies on who? Right? Mark is written first. In what way does Matthew and what way does Luke use it? And what's the importance of the fact that Matthew writes to Jewish Christians and Luke writes to a Roman military person? Look at it here. Same thing here. Who stays closer to who? What does it matter? What does it matter that Matthew goes to Jewish people and Luke writes to Theophilus? One more. This is often called divorce text. I don't think this is necessarily about divorce. I'm just going to skip it just down to Mark and to Matthew. I want you to notice that it says, they came to test him. To test him. Look at the difference in the question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Go back to the book and notice the different story about what the school of Hillel thought about divorce and what the school of Shammai thought about divorce. And they're trying to test Jesus. I think they want to know if Jesus is more in line with Shammai or Hillel. And what is different at the end of these two? And how does knowing the two-source theory help you understand how to deal with Scripture? And maybe if this is not really about divorce, then what is it about? And did you even know that there were two different accounts? So why do we typically only talk about the second one in churches? How come we make divorced people second-rate citizens sometimes? I'm not talking about making divorce an easy deal, but there's a lot of pain about divorce, isn't there? So we're going to do that in an assignment. But remember, this is the Mediterranean. For example, here, the Gospel of Mark goes to Rome. And so does the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Matthew goes all the way to Antioch. Look how far that is from one another. And yet sometimes we read it in the same way. That goes to very distinct people. We got to be careful with that, right? Okay.